Okay, continuing in chapter, what are we in? Chapter 17, The Rape of the Mind. This is video number 2. Yep, chapter 17, From Old to New Courage. And we are reading from The Rape of the Mind by Mind.wmv. Alright. No one can really tell how he will behave in times of danger. Each person will solve the frightening test that reality confronts him with in his own way. Several will accept the challenge and stand up to it. Some over-defensive, compulsive individuals may even welcome this burden as a test of their strength. Still others, whose instability has deep roots in the past, will unconsciously take advantage of a perilous situation to break down completely and let their tears and emotions go. Freud has directed our attention to the peculiar interplay between external and internal dangers, between frightening reality and equally frightening fantasy. Objective, recognizable dangers often stimulate the mind to alertness and encourage it to set up its inner defenses. But there are subjective panic creators too: frustration, feeling of guilt, infantile horror fantasies, and these can often be so terrorizing in their effects that our cultural defenses collapse. Many men who face the test of reality with stalwart courage can be brought to collapse by apparent trivia, which somehow touch them in a vulnerable spot. Another of my wartime patients mentioned previously showed such a pattern. The young fighter pilot, who had flown 40 combat missions without any sign of fear or panic, suddenly broke down completely in an air raid shelter in London. In the course of treatment, it became apparent that this young man was bitterly unhappy about his personal relationships. He did not get along with his commanding officer. He had a serious quarrel with his girlfriend the night before the breakdown. A shy and withdrawn person, when he suddenly found himself in the shelter with a frightened group about him, he became contaminated by the fear in the atmosphere. Weakened by recent unhappiness, he found himself completely unable to put up with the inner defenses that had served him so well under the frightening experiences of active war. Are we to say that he was less of a hero than the much decorated machine gunner? There still lives in all of us an admiration for bravado, for the theatrical display of courage, for the devil-may-care invitation to destruction. We are beginning to recognize now that real courage is different. It is at one and the same time an expression of faith in life and a resignation to death. Courage is not something that can be forced on a man from the outside. It has to come from inside him. In the reality of modern war, the impersonal Moloch, a man can be easily reduced to a feeling of helplessness and dependency. Personal courage can turn the tide of battle into a hand-to-hand encounter, but personal courage is no defense against bombs and machine guns. Today, reckless courage, as we have glorified it, is less important than personal morale, faith, conviction, knowledge, and adequate preparation. A boy of 17 years of age is drafted into the Army. He has spent his entire life in a small town in Texas. He receives training in the routine of Army life and the use of weapons. Soon thereafter, he is sent to Korea, and almost immediately he is taken prisoner. Now this child has to defend himself against the propaganda barrage which well-trained communist theoreticians daily hurl at him. His education is limited, his background narrow, his political training inadequate. He even tries to escape from his prison camp but is caught. As a result, the enemy's mental hold on him increases. His great disappointment makes him feel trapped. Finally, he surrenders and collaborates. How can a military court hold him responsible and even punishable for the fact that he finally gave in to enemy propaganda? This is part of the story of Corporal Claude Batchelor, recently sentenced to 20 years imprisonment for collaboration with the enemy. I would venture to guess that it could have been the story of nearly any American boy of similar background. After the Second World War, several European countries had to face the difficult problem of how to treat those members of the underground who, after torture by the Nazis, had confessed and betrayed their compatriots. In Holland, a court of honor was established to judge these special cases. This court reached the following conclusions. No man can possibly vouch for it that under no circumstances will he confess, cooperate, or betray his country. No man who has not himself gone through the hell which communists and Nazis have been so able to organize has any right to judge the conduct of a man who did. Psychological torture is more effective in many cases than physical torture. This is all the more true of a victim who has above average intellectual background. It seems that intelligence makes physical torture more easily bearable, but at the same time exposes one more to the impact of mental torture. Anyone who submitted under such circumstances to the enemy after having given proof of his loyalty, patriotism, and courage will suffer terribly, because his condemnation of himself will always be more severe than that of any judge. There is, however, not the slightest reason for shame, nor considering such a person incapacitated for giving leadership. On the contrary, more than outsiders, he will know what superhuman strength is required to resist the subtle methods of mental torture. And more than outsiders, he can be helpful to others to prepare themselves for the ordeal as far as that is at all possible. And the note at the bottom says, from a letter written by G. van Heuven Goodhart, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, President of the Dutch Court of Honor, which appeared in the New York Times March 15, 1954. Okay, the morale-boosting idea. When we look at the varieties of human behavior under extreme and pressing circumstances, we see how easily man can be subdued, and at the same time we see that certain factors seem to have a positive effect on his morale, keeping him from despair and collapse. When these factors are operative, the spirit revives and people are enabled to live with integrity in spite of dangerous circumstances. There are many such morale boosters. Religious faith or political ideology are among them. Perhaps the most effective is the sense of having some mission and inner goal. This ideal with which a man identifies can be love of the native land, love of freedom, of justice, or even the thought of hate and revenge. Whatever it is, at the moment of calamity, a guiding idea is as much needed as mere physical strength and endurance. In every case where the individual has learned to withstand danger and to maintain at least some of his normal esprit under circumstances of deprivation, want, and brutality, one or more of the morale-boosting factors must have been present. I do not believe that the inner search for the morale-boosting regenerative idea is a conscious function of the mind. Such psychological regeneration is comparable with the physical regenerative processes which we see in the body. The body hardly ever gives up its regenerative capacities. Even when a man is dying of cancer, his surgical wounds still heal. The local regenerating forces are still there. The same thing seems to operate on a mental level. In times of confusion, pressure, and exhaustion, man's psychological healing and regenerating forces are still in action. This applies as much to large groups of people as it does to the individual, though in the former, restraining forces remain in action because of intricate interpersonal relationships. My experiences with people living in the utmost dangerous circumstances showed that very soon after an initial bewilderment, the individuals develop an inner need for what we might call mental budgeting. They all display observable clinical symptoms indicating that this process of regaining their self-assertive resistance is going on. When they first come to the prison camps, for instance, they show complete passivity, surrender, and depersonalization. But soon a guiding idea begins to grow out of their need to understand fate, their need for protective intercommunication and adherence to some common faith, for building something for the self. We can detect this favorable change in mood by the way every prisoner makes his own corner a place of security, even when it is only a dirty wooden bunk. He begins to rearrange the few things he has, he builds his own nest, and from it he begins to look out into his miserable, marginal world. And I think I'll stop right there so I don't run out of time. And that was, I think that was part 2. Is that part 2? Yep, that was part 2 of chapter 17. We're reading from The Rape of the Mind. And I will see you in part 3.